Welcome to the While You Were Working podcast, presented by Rogue Marketing. When you're responsible for revenue, it's hard to look up from the work. But while you're doing your day job, the market shifts. While You Were Working is where we turn today's trends into tomorrow's strategies. Welcome to While You Were Working.
Welcome to While You Were Working, the podcast for revenue accountable business leaders wanting to stay ahead of the curve. I'm Chip Rosales, managing partner of Rogue Marketing. Rogue is a strategic marketing agency that helps clients defend their marketing spend. We're business builders who carry a marketing toolbox, and I'm so glad you're joining us. It's hard to keep up with the trends and insights that are shaping business when you're busy driving growth. That's why we regularly sit down with revenue accountable leaders, unpacking their experience and sharing actionable insights. The world moves fast while you're working, and today's guest is at the forefront of growing revenue in a sometimes charged, highly opinionated industry, law enforcement. I'm joined today by Josh Conklin. He's the Chief Revenue Officer at Leo Technologies and has the incredible task of supporting a variety of law enforcement partners in their mission to serve and protect through cutting-edge tools and technologies that speed up the investigation process and keep communities safe. You know, you're a great leader to speak on all of this because you've had a career built around just having this knack of pulling different components and pieces together and making something magical happen. So I'm so excited to get you in this chair and to be able to talk about how you're growing revenue in such a tight-knit and really highly insulated industry.
Well, thanks, Chip. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
So I just gave a description of some of what Leo Tech is doing. How would you describe how Leo Technology is working?
Great question. Leo Tech is one of the most fascinating businesses that I've ever had an opportunity to work in. I would describe us as pulling together data sets that don't exist in other areas that maybe law enforcement doesn't even know exist to help aid investigations and improve public safety. Technology has an unbelievable role to play in everything we do in our lives. And unfortunately, government and law enforcement in general tend to sometimes have less access to some of those great technologies for a variety of reasons. But what Leo's doing is bringing really intelligent people together with law enforcement professionals and former law enforcement professionals and making that technology work for the benefit of public safety.
You've had a career in all sorts of areas of public safety. What drove you to be a part of this particular industry? What's kept you in a chair like this?
You know, honestly, I got there by chance. I spent the early part of my career in telecommunications back in the competitive local exchange area where we were doing dial tone services for businesses. I had some early interfaces during that window with law enforcement, but a CEO that I had worked for in the past contacted me back in 2009 and asked me to come to this inmate phone company, and I didn't even realize there wasn't such thing as inmate phone companies, right? So it started in telecommunications, but ended up in telecommunications for the incarcerated population. And it's such a fascinating industry because you have multiple sets of customers. You have, mom and dad who are unfortunately suffering the challenges associated with having a loved one incarcerated. You have that incarcerated person who is, behind the walls of a correctional facility and wanting to communicate with the people on the outside. And then you have law enforcement who is necessarily creating some challenges for themselves by allowing communications outside a correctional facility. And so I really got into the law enforcement side of it, understanding how technology can help secure communities. You know, I look around, I'm at the park with my kids or out in the community, and I see all of the safety that is provided and having, getting under the covers of law enforcement a little bit, you can see the environment they are providing for us. And so just being able to be a part of helping them do their job when they're, in my opinion, always operating with less resource than they need, with less people than they need, with less technology they need, being able to jump in and be a part of the solution to that and help them do the great work that they do is just, it's one of those things that gets you up in the morning.
I'm sure you can't walk through this world without seeing all of those little intricacies. It just has to be true. One of the things that I know has been said about you is that you've got this knack for being able to kind of keep the big picture in mind while also looking at the small details. How do you do that?
You know, I've had the benefit of working with some really talented business leaders over the course of my career, and I've always just tried to be a listener first, and speak second, and the people that I have had the chance to work with have really taught me about understanding your various stakeholders in any situation that you're in, and not trying to apply, and I'll use sales process as an example, not try to apply sales process the way it worked for you at a previous company, but really listen to what are the goals and objectives of your shareholders? What are the goals and objectives of the organization as a whole? What's the mission of the company? And then try to build those processes that you operate under around those folks, so that you can, and again, always keeping in mind, again, if you're not satisfying shareholders, problem. If you're not satisfying customers, problem. If you've got unhappy employees, problem, right? And so building the processes that you execute every day around all those individual shareholders is, in my mind, one of the biggest keys to being successful.
So it's not a one size fits all, huh?
No, it never is, in fact, no. Especially when it gets to law enforcement. It's funny you asked, you said this earlier, but working in law enforcement, if you work in correctional facilities, as an example, there's about 3,100 prospects nationwide. And I find it ironic. I get phone calls all the time from people who are lead generation kind of salespeople. They're like, let me come help you identify who your customers are.
You're like, that's pretty easy.
I know exactly who my customers are, right? And so my sales process is very different than it was in a B2B environment where I had 200,000 opportunities in a particular community. Now if I'm thinking about Dallas, Texas, I've got 30 or 40.
What else do you have as priorities for growing revenue at Leotech?
Interesting. I have had one thing I have formed over the course of my career is, I may not be the smartest guy out there, so I'd really try to simplify things. And I think that is really beneficial in a business environment.
It's a skill set.
Absolutely. And so I use a formula I call people, motion, process. And because everything starts with getting the right people. If you have the wrong person in a chair, doesn't matter how fast they move or what processes you apply to them, it's not going to work. So you always do people first. When you get a team of people that you feel really good about, then you think about motion. What things do I need them doing on a consistent basis, right? And that's where I'm talking about establishing sales process. What that means to me is that I'm sending people out with I'm evaluating what's worked best for me in the past. How did we get to our biggest customers, our best clients? How did we get there? What steps did we follow? And then try to replicate that process over and over and over again. And then the last one is process. And that is what are the actual steps that we're taking in the process? When do we make phone calls? How often do we follow up? What presentation materials are we using? What points are we trying to communicate to those individual buyer personas, and really start to refine and get methodical about how you approach the market. But you can never do motion without process, and you can never do the best process in the world. Doesn't matter if you're not doing it enough, right? And so you got to follow that rule, and then it's wash, rinse, repeat, right? The right people now might not be the right people later. And so you may have to start over. Your motion may be the wrong motion, and your process can always be improved. And so you just focus on those three areas, whatever business that you're in. If you're trying to grow revenue, I see so many people focusing on bringing in a sales training organization because we got to get the process right. And they got all the wrong people. And the people aren't paying attention to the things they're supposed to be paying attention to. And so it's ultimately self-defeating, which is, again, probably why bringing in a training program and spending $100,000 trying to train a big sales organization usually doesn't work. They don't adopt it. They don't follow it. And it falls to the wayside because they didn't follow the first steps of the process.
That makes so much sense. So are you seeing technology as the pathway to growth for what you guys are doing?
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that then. Let's talk about some of the things that you're doing from a technology perspective. Obviously, we don't want to give any secret sauce away. That's a very important component. But talk to us a little bit. I mean, you've got ChatGPT out there. You've got large language models. You've got all of these things that are at play. And literally, there's probably new versions today than there was last week, right? So those things are always evolving. How are you using technology to assist you here?
It's I talk to clients, and as crazy as this might sound, interfacing with them sometimes requires interfacing with their mainframes, right? So there's a lot of agencies who just really haven't made it into the current generation, and because of the length of procurement processes, et cetera, for them to do these things themselves, by the time they implement new technology, it's already outdated, and they need newer stuff. There's newer stuff available. So the private sector really does support law enforcement in a very critical way. And I don't think you'd talk to anyone in law enforcement who wouldn't acknowledge that, right? They're partners on the outside. are very, very important ultimately to their success, because we can go and hire 30 or 40 developers and have them working on the latest and greatest technologies that might be a public sector development kind of a technology. You mentioned ChatGPT as an example. So using a large language model where, well, if we're analyzing communications, what's better than a large language model to go over the top of that, right? But for a law enforcement agency to get those things and be able to use them in an effective way, it could take years and years and years, whereas we can do it in months.
So your mind goes all sorts of ways. Either that's the technology space, going from larger environments down to more niche ones. There's so many different facets that kind of come into your taking this CRO role and this CRO chair. What does it mean to you to be a CRO of a place like Leotech?
When you start your career in sales, right, you are responsible for revenue, whether you know it or not, right? And all that a CRO is, I mean, I tell my team this all the time. You're never going to stop me from being a sales guy. You know, my first job was selling vacuum cleaners door to door, right? So I'm never going to stop being a salesperson, because I have this passion for finding problems and meeting needs with solutions that I can bring to the table. And to me, there's nothing better than I win, they win, everybody's happy. That's like the best thing in the world from a career perspective. Absolutely. Something about a win-win, right? Something, I don't know. But when I go back to how do I approach the CRO role, the difference in I think a CRO role, a sales leader role, and even an individual sales position is that you start thinking about the stuff that Chip Rosales thinks about, right? You start thinking about how am I marketing my product? How am I communicating to the end users about its value? How am I, through the life cycle of client relationships, how am I continuing to measure their satisfaction with the product, adjust what we're doing according to what they need, and making sure that there's, again, a high degree of satisfaction all the way through the life cycle of a client, from the very first time you have a conversation with them through that renewal window, whenever they, that to me is the magic sauce, right? Because they chose to buy from you because of what some sales guy said, right? And promised them. If your company delivers, right, then that shows up in that renewal window where they say, I bought it the first time, I'm going to buy it again. And in fact, I might buy more of it because I'm starting to see what, the value that this organization brings to the table. That to me is magic, but it's much bigger than just acquiring the client. It's making sure that they are ultimately satisfied through their life cycle. And that to me is the magic of what a revenue officer is supposed to do. Because if it's going out the back door faster than you can bring it in the front door, well, guess what? You're not growing.
What's one thing you make sure to do every day as a leader?
When I wake up every day, the first thing I think about doing is contacting my team members, reaching out. I'm not calling you to say what's your plan for the day. I'm calling to ask, how'd you sleep? How's your night going? Let people know that you're there, you're working, but you care.
What's a metric that you think is the best indicator that revenue is going to grow?
I like to measure pipeline growth, close ratio, and sales cycle. Those are three things that I think are very, very important. So if you know how fast something typically converts to opening conversation to win or loss, because losses are fine. Some people get really wound up about losing things. Losses are fine. It's just, it's another, you just got to get to an answer from a prospective client. So knowing what percentage of the time it's a yes and what percentage of the time it's a no, that's number one. How long does that take on average, right? Start to finish, right? And then now I just got to measure my pipeline. Of course, you can get more sophisticated. What phases of pipeline are you in at that particular time? But what's the size of my pipeline? When did it start? Where's it at now? And as long as you have those three measurements, you can reliably predict sales volume. I used to have a previous company that I was at, high activity company. We're talking like tens of thousands of appointments that are happening. And I started measuring this stuff on a consistent basis, and I built a spreadsheet. I'm going to date myself here. Built an Excel spreadsheet, and I could get within 2% every single month of what sales volume was going to be on the first day of the month by measuring activity from the previous month, blending that with activity for the previous 90 days, applying my 6-month close ratio to it. I could get you within 2%. So much so that my then executive vice president that I was reporting to, I started I made a bet with him, and I started applying my spreadsheet to other markets that I didn't have. They're giving a forecast, and I could get closer to their forecast than they were getting to their forecast. And again, it's, I had their old sales manager I used to work with many years ago used to say that numbers tell me a lot about people, or people tell me a lot about their numbers, but the numbers tell me a whole lot more about the people, right? And that's maybe too much on that side of measuring things, but it just goes to show you that things are very predictable if you understand the key drivers of your business, whatever your business is, and then just measure them relentlessly.
It's so important. I appreciate the gamification of what you just did there too, and just the mischievousness, just a little bit in your eyes, just a little bit in your eyes. That was pretty fun to watch.
Yeah, they started our numbers guy. His name was Darren. Darren used to start, called it the Conklin forecasting tool. And even so much so, the business started asking, okay, what's the forecast from the sales team? What's the forecast from the spreadsheet? And they got to where they were trusting the spreadsheet maybe a little bit more than the forecast of the individuals who are verbally reporting, because those are all so filled with desire, right? It's not bad, but when you ask a salesperson or a sales manager, even what's your forecast for the month, it's coming from a place of their desire to succeed, right? Which is why they're always inflated. Like over and over again, it's you tell me you're going to do 100, it's probably going to come in at 75. And it's just the way that it is. Well, that's because you really believed that other 25 was going to happen. There's nothing wrong with that, right? The inherent optimism of a salesperson, you need it, right? It needs to be there. And if it's not, I worry, right? If it's, nothing's ever going to close. Well, gosh, of course nothing's going to close, right? You need that stuff. So take it with a grain of salt when they tell you that. I think it's a good exercise for them to get forecasts from people. But make sure you're doing your own independent evaluation would be my advice, and start making sure you understand what those key metrics are that drive your business. And by the way, our business, much harder to do that in, right? Because the sample size is so small, right? We may get in front of 5 or 6 new clients a month, or prospective clients a month. Whereas in that previous company, we're talking literally about 50 people doing 10 appointments a week.
All right. Well, I appreciate you spending your time with us today. And thank you for teaching us about a space that many people don't have any context for. So I really appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chip.
Today's guest works at the intersection of technology and public service, helping law enforcement do their jobs smarter and faster. That got me thinking about the balance between mission and measurement, which tied perfectly to a recent MarTech article on B2B marketing. The piece argues that when companies focus too narrowly on providing immediate ROI, they actually weaken their long-term effectiveness. The big aha was this: short-term thinking can undercut brand building, audience trust, and bigger wins that take time to mature. It's also nice to know that CFOs are 73% supportive of brand marketing and value metrics like customer acquisition cost and lifetime value. So why do I bring this up? Many organizations need to remember that credibility and awareness aren't built overnight. In a business where you aren't allowed, or maybe can't afford to be as loud as you'd like to be, it's wise to remember that trust compounds over time. If every move is judged only by quick returns, you could miss out on deeper growth. A link to this article is posted in the show notes. We'd also invite you to follow us on social media. You can search Rogue Marketing on Facebook and X, or Rogue Marketing Agency on LinkedIn. We are regularly sharing insights and articles that you may have missed, while you were working. See you next time.